Good evening all. I have decided it's evening. Good evening all. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilisations to mark the inauguration of Professor Sarah Savant. Here at ISMC, we believe highly in the importance of scholarly development and hope to provide the greatest of opportunities for all of our staff. This evening, we are honored to organize this lecture to celebrate Dr. Savant's promotion, which is a mark of recognition for the brilliant research and work she has completed and continues to do. Sarah Savant, I hope I'm getting this right now, Sarah. Sarah Savant is a cultural historian specializing in the Middle East and Iran from about 600 to 1100 Common Era. She received her PhD from Harvard University in 2006 and shortly joined us at AKU-ISMC in 2007. Dr. Savant has played an integral role in the field, launching the famous project KITAB, Knowledge, Information Technology and the Arabic Book, the first Arabic digital humanities project to study the reuse of text using algorithms. I would like to reflect upon some of her notable work, from leading a large international organization of professional scholars of the Middle East as President and Vice President of Middle East Medievalists from 2013 to 2019, to publishing remarkable works, which I'm sure Sarah will tell you more about in a short while. What I can tell you is that Sarah is highly recognized by her colleagues in the field, which is a tremendous achievement for anyone as a scholar. Just recently, we had a request from a US scholar who wanted to bring his research project to us at AKU-ISMC. He referred to Sarah's work as seminal, as a basis to build upon. And I can proudly say that this international recognition is a true example of all the amazing work which Sarah is bringing to AKU-ISMC. As you may hear, I'm now doing an introduction. The format for the rest of the evening will be as follows. As soon as I'm finished, Sarah will give a talk titled A Close and Distant Reading of Writerly Practices. After what I'm sure will be an enjoyable and insightful presentation, we will open the floor for questions and comments. I would also like to highlight that there will be a warm reception in the atrium and with food and drinks, and you are all welcome to enjoy it. May I also add that for those who are visiting for the first time, the washrooms are out of the door to my left. You can use that one as two, of course, but the washrooms are over there. So I would like to formally welcome Dr. Sarah Savant to the floor, and please join me for a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Leif. It's been a pleasure to work with so many people here in this room for now many years. And in what follows, I'm going to make some comments. I'd also like to acknowledge the folks who are online, because we have, I think, some people online and we're recording for posterity. And I'm looking forward to questions from here and also from the people who are online. But I feel like I'm really among friends, and that's quite nice. I've known many of you a long time, and some of you, Shay Newell, for example, from long before I came here, in fact, who maybe is sort of responsible for me being here, if I want to put it all together in my thinking. So I really am delighted. In what follows, I have been guided by Farouk Topan. I wrote to Farouk because Americans, you can tell from my accent if you didn't know already, if you don't know me, we don't have this tradition of an inaugural. So I said, okay. I made professor, I hope this isn't giving away the game, but I made professor in 2019. And in 2019, I was busy because we were starting the project with EREC funding. And then along came COVID. And I just kept thinking, well, I don't want to celebrate, making professor amidst COVID where nobody can come. It's going to be really depressing. I'll wait. And I also, to be honest, was a bit afraid I mean, I was afraid of this lecture format that I didn't know what it was. I didn't know who would come. I was afraid no one would come. And I thought, right. So Farouk, I wrote to a few weeks ago, and I said, Farouk, okay, it's coming now, finally. What do I have to do? And he sent me some comments. And I should say Farouk, for those who don't know him, was also the director of ISMC prior to Leif. And David Taylor and Abdul Falali Ansari, all people who I've had the great pleasure of working for. And Farouk wrote to me and said that I'm supposed to speak on any area I wish. It's a celebration. Ideally, probably on my own research. I mean, I could stand up and give a lecture on football.
Please.
I think, I know. We had a lovely lecture last week on football. I think you'd all be terribly disappointed if I gave a lecture on football. I might talk about the American football, but, you know, I'm probably no Ted Lasso. And I'm supposed to share with you my views on the future of my own field and my own understanding of it. So what follows then is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt really firstly to look at maybe a little bit of my past and then what I understand to be our present and future. I'd like to highlight what the team and I are doing on KITAB and to give you just a really general picture of the kind of research we're doing. And I think that's why I'm professor. You know, I think the work that we're doing on KITAB is the major contribution, you know, to the field. And that's teamwork. I think it's really important, and I'll try to emphasize that in as many ways as I can, that there's a group of people working together, solving problems day in and day out. I'm looking at something now. And that teamwork is really important. And it's not, you know, it's part of the enterprise. You know, it's really a lot of something we spend a lot of time thinking about together. The title, A Close and Distant Reading of Writerly Practices. So you could say, well, why? You know, what does this mean? So maybe to define, close is what you and I do all the time. We read things closely. But it also can refer to maybe a forensic reading of texts and really seeing a text as a tissue of quotations, to quote Roland Barthes. Its composition can be studied intensively. So that's close reading, in my understanding. Distant reading is a term that was coined by Franco Moretti, also a literary scholar. And by that, I'm referring and using it, perhaps not quite in sync with Franco Moretti, to refer to what really we can only do algorithmically in computers. So what can we learn when we are able to take an abstraction and look at the entirety of the written tradition, or at least as much as we can get our hands on. Lest I lose you along the way, I'm going to offer you some conclusions right now, so that if your mind drifts, you know, you'll know where I was going. The first, I want to convince you of the power of the digital working on book history, and also history in general. So I really want you to understand why we're so passionate as a team about book history with the digital. Digital makes it easier to see the roles of people in creating books. So we might think of the digital as anonymous or as something that's a machine, but actually I think we're able to get closer to the people who created works through the digital, and I think that's very powerful. We also learn a lot about the text of the book, especially how it was put together. And in a certain way, I think the digital allows us to walk around the print. The team's very fond of saying this, that the print was a moment in time. We have manuscripts, scrolls, other forms of the material object prior to the creation of print works, and quite late in the Arabic context for print. But the digital allows us to try to see through that phase, back to the earlier periods. So I'm hoping also to convince you that the digital allows us to see some of that. And then I want to, grandly, make you think about the basic idea of book. You know, what does it mean? What is this idea of a book? What did it mean to people? And how expansive should we think of this term? Right, okay, so that's my grand agenda. So let me start. Okay. Good, so just quick flyby tour, you know. So ISMC 2000 to 2022, this is my history and the Institute's history as well. So I came here in the very beginning. I wasn't the very first, group of people to start this institute, but I was with the first class, the first graduating class. And You can see here some sample photos, but I guess I'm particularly sort of pleased by Abdifalali Ansari here, this older photo. And then I have Fareed Panjwani in this picture, me teaching a group of students at graduation, and then perhaps a little bit of a stage photo, of from the marketing group, which I like. I like that photo. So. Middle East medievalists. These are highlights, I think, of the last 2 years for me. I was president for 4 years of Middle East medievalists, and then prior to that, I was the vice president. And I do feel like intellectually I grew up with the people that are part of the Middle East medievalists. I've given some photos here. I also had the great pleasure of giving prizes, which is so much fun. And I gave the Lifetime Achievement Award on 3 or 4 occasions. We have a picture here of Antoine Barut, and if he's online, hello Antoine, who is one of my great collaborators over many years and who also works in the same fields as I do, and Alison Vaca, who is the secretary of the organization after. Arabic Pasts, which has been run in this room now for some years, I think is a great highlight. You should be hearing, I hope, a little bit of the sense that medieval history, and we haven't gone to book history yet, but Arabic Paths is a workshop that we've run since 2009 here at the Institute. It now brings between 40 and as many as 50 people into the building and online now to learn about how people have written about Arabic history over many centuries. So just some choice photos. My co-organizers, Hugh Kennedy, there in the bottom here, and James McDougall, and Conrad Hirschler also in the early phases, and also Julia Bray at one point. We have various action photos, and we've published in 2014 a book, or an issue of Dar es Salaam. In terms of, that's the field, and that's my place, I think, in the field a bit, in a snapshot. But in terms of intellectually, in terms of my own work, I did begin, as I said, working on history writing especially. I'm particularly interested in how the past has been constructed, how people remember. I've written, my main book is The New Muslims of Post-Conquest Iran, which was not my thesis. I wasn't so wise as I would advise people now, which is, if you're going to write and spend many years working on a project, publish it. I did not. It's sitting here, though, if you want to have a peek at it. But I did take part of it. And then I began this project, which for me was, I think, quite a challenge, which was, and quite a luxury, I should say, because I wasn't under the tenure pressures of the American system, frankly. I was able to step back a bit and think about what it is I really wanted to say. And I spent some years thinking about the way in which the past was changed in the period of Iran's conversion. So I thought a lot about how sort of myths and stories about the early pre-Islamic past changed, also the time of the Prophet, and then the later periods, especially the conquest. So I did a lot of comparison, of the ways in which you had one set of stories prior and then one set of stories later. For those who don't work in Islamic history, maybe a couple of facts would be helpful. First, the dating of Islamic history, Hijri, begins 622 with the movement of the Prophet's community from Mecca to Medina. The Prophet died in 632. So if you're just wondering, like, where in time do I place Islamic history, this is important. Also, the main language of texts until the 10th century is Arabic. And then a period starting end of the 9th century and onwards, you begin to have Persian, what's New Persian. And for myself, I was very interested in that period of the 9th and 10th centuries as a kind of changing point in the way in which writing could be done. So the geography would span from Spain, modern Spain, all the way into South Asia, across all sorts of territories and peoples. So that vast region and its kind of different, complicated identities was very interesting to me, and in particularly the case of Iran. So this concept of Iran was very much a part of my scholarship and really taking it apart. There were years where I thought very much about what it meant to say someone was Persian versus Iranian, and I've written about the invention of the idea of Iran at a later period. I've also sort of spent quite a bit of time thinking about how the categories people use to refer to themselves evolved, over time. One of the questions that I was interested in was, what is it that these terms meant to people of the time versus what we understand them to mean today? So there's this one term, for example, shu'ubiyya, which some of you will be familiar with, and it's periodically revived to refer to a sense used by people who speak Arabic and Arabs today of what we might think of as kind of Persian self-consciousness, pride, etc. In my experience, you can't find it actually in the sources as that. That when you really look through and comb the sources, you discover that this is a concept that has a lot of salience today. It had salience, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but that the situation was much more interesting and complicated, in the period, and that this kind of Arab versus Persian opposition that we look at the sources and try to find doesn't hold in the same way. And so I translated Ibn Qutayba's book on the excellence of the Arabs because it was understood to be one of the major polemics of this Shu'ubiyya period. And I used it to make all sorts of arguments basically about the existence or non-existence of this phenomenon of Shu'ubiyya. And I think it's important for how we understand how people conceive themselves in the past, but also for the present, because often it's this early period, which is sometimes called the golden period of Islam, that modern folks, Muslims, go back to and cite as an example. So for example, the term Shu'ubiyya was invoked by Saddam Hussein in Iraq as a way of othering Persians or Iranians. So much of what I've then worked on is, we might say, is about memory and this problematic of the layering of tradition over time and its changes was how I thought of memory. I thought of this issue that we can compare, like stratigraphy, across time, different versions of events that we know to have happened, see how attitudes change, and therefore understand perceptions. And this is classic historiography, how people think about historiography. The problems of remembering also, to me, raised the issue of forgetting. So Antoine Baruch is very, I think, correctly fond of saying that memory is part remembrance, but it's also part oblivion. And I've written about oblivion as well. So the topic of Umberto Eco a few years ago wrote an article that was playful. He spent 25 years in his desk drawer, actually, and then he finally published it. But it was, how would you construct a forgetting arts? So I decided I was going to try and do that. I was going to try and take up that challenge. And I wrote, a piece rather playfully at a kind of, I don't think anyone knew quite what to make of it when I first gave the paper, where I talked about methods that people try to forget, things in their own past. So I made it quite personal. So writing over, we write over things we give a news story. And so here you have just, a manuscript where that's being done quite bluntly. Crowding out, when you pile on details so that you can no longer remember what it is that you want to forget. And then abstraction, which is quite an abstract idea maybe even, but the idea being that often we'll choose categories, like in the Islamic case, calling people mushrik, or maybe polytheist, sometimes the term is translated, when in fact we're talking about people who knew themselves to be other, to be Jewish or Christian, for example, in the time of the conquest. That kind of abstracting and what it does to memory of the actual people who were involved at the time. So this phenomenon of the layering of history was very important to me through this period in my scholarship. But I had doubts. And my nagging conscience said, okay, right, here I am, I'm trained, I've written my PhD thesis, I'm now writing a book. This is before I finished my book. What about what I don't know? I think I've done a pretty good job combing the library, but Harvard Library, where I was, is enormous, and I can't look at everything. And even if I could, how would I even comprehend everything that I can see, and how would I do those comparisons? What's more, I knew that I didn't have everything that once existed. Even if I could get everything out of Harvard Library, I was never going to be able to have everything that once existed. So my idea about memory, about all these comparisons, it didn't quite sit right with me. I knew that there was a problem with this, that I could surely contrast, but The sample. What about the sample? What about what I was choosing to compare? Also, thinking about writing in memory, when you write about the past, it's a major way of creating and perpetuating memory in groups. That much I was pretty confident about. They update, writers update when they create new sources, and they rely on earlier ones, and then theirs become later ones. So there's a churning in the tradition, of you couldn't write in the 14th century, for example, about the prophet's lifetime, a new book without looking at an old one. It's the same as we have today. So this issue of reliance on sources was also very much in my mind. To say, if somebody in the 12th century had an attitude about Persians, how was I to know, what was part of their own thinking versus what was part of earlier thinking, and what they changed if I couldn't compare everything? So I found myself producing this confident book, and it did win the prize for one of the major prizes for Iranian studies, but I felt uncertain. I had doubt, and I didn't ignore that. So I had an aha moment. And this, I think, sometimes people say they've had aha moments, and I think when you've had one, So you can see here Turnitin, the anti-plagiarism software. Back in 2012, it was new, and we were beginning to run our students' papers through it. And I started to think, what if we could take all of the texts that we can get, so not just what I know, and then we could compare them with Turnitin. Let's see what Turnitin tells us about how people rewrote the past, because we can see the changes if we can just do this with Turnitin. So I wrote to Turnitin because I'm an optimist, and I got no reply. So I wrote again. I got a slight reply saying, it's not economical. We're not going to do that. So I was really quite sure. And Hugh Kennedy, Antoine again, heard a lot about this. I spoke about it. I also felt like I had a secret. I felt like I have to be careful, because if I talk too much about this, someone else will get the idea and they'll go get Turnitin to do it. So anyways, this idea of looking at repetition algorithmically sat with me. And eventually, so this is just a diagram of in the series of questions I was asking, I put together kind of an idea. First, I thought, right, we have to think about Arabic book history as a field. And we need to think about, the history of the field. And for those, I'm not probably going to repeat all of this on the slide, but we need to think about the early tradition. We need to understand, the issue of fragments, etc. But we also need to turn to digital humanities. And here I've just included a few photos of people who were really helpful to me at this time. So I came across Greg Crane, and I can't actually remember how I heard about Greg Crane. But he was running the Perseus Digital Library at Tufts, and I went to visit him as a fun pilgrimage. And I told him about my idea, and he said, right, of course. He said, David Smith, who's in this bottom right on the screen, David Smith's working on that. And he's worked on it for American newspapers in the Civil War period, and I'm sure, I'll put you in touch. And then I met the other two folks in this photo. I met the other Maxim Romanov, and then Sohail Merchant, who's sitting here in this room, my colleague, patiently sat with me as we worked out how to work on this project and this issue of combining perhaps two fields to try to solve a problem. By this point, I think the idea was beginning, but I think now I would understand more that the intervention intellectually of what this marriage of book history and digital humanities is really representative of a moment in our own culture, a moment in time. So you have on the one hand, this history of reading. Scholars have looked at reading history, so readers, communities, people who work on manuscripts, look at reading notes, paratexts, reception history. These are major fields in literary and historical studies. And then the other side, you have the history of writing, which is what historians have always been interested in. It's much of what Arabic past looks at. So thinking about text, narratives, change, it's what my own book looks at, the history of writing. But then there's a middle ground, this history of reuse and recycling, which essentially says, right, when we have a text, and we know it has its own history and sources, we can think about what it is that writers who created the text were reading when they created it. So reuse and recycling, taking earlier works and putting them into new works, I would now posit is a field itself. So if you've had a marriage between the digital humanities and between book history, I would propose we have a new field as well. We might call this a history of reuse and recycling. In my writing, I'm trying to position this as its own moment. If you think about now all of the work in social media, and you think about music and mixing, I think we're all aware of how much culture is very mediated and how it repeats and follows tropes and memes. And my children who are sitting in this room can tell you all about memes and how Reddit functions and Twitter, etc. And so all of this repetition, which we see around us today, is a very modern version of it, but cultures always have reproduced themselves, through reuse and recycling, and we can track it. So to make a long story maybe short, or maybe not so short, we worked for some years, Sohail playing a major role, and also Maxime, David, Greg as an advisor, and then other folks, including here 2 volunteers on the right, Malik Merchant and Ahmed Saki, who to try to come up with a way to turn it in for Arabic. And we had the support of the Institute. We got a server, which was brilliant. We also got occasional funds to hire people to help us with various things. And we applied to the ERC in 2017 and failed. Sorry, we applied to the ERC in 2015 and failed. We applied again in 2016, and then we had it in 2017. So it took a while, but we convinced the European Research Council. So for those who might not be familiar, the European Research Council funds a very large percentage, and we hope continues to fund a very large percentage of funding in the UK and Europe, and also outside of Europe, in fact. And hopefully our government will continue to support that endeavor. But it's really the main mechanism that you would have to do anything at large and scale. So securing ERC funding was extremely important for being able to put into practice this idea, of book history and reuse and recycling and all these ideas, that were floating around at the time. We also published a journal on digital humanities at the time, a group of us, including Maxine and Matt Miller. The ERC, so let me just speak about the ERC, and then I promise to get on with some more content. So the ERC, this grant, which is 2 million euros over the course of 5 years up until next year, works on the periods that we work on the period 700 to 1500. We're interested in regions across the Muslim world, and team members are responsible for different regions. And we work on a corpus, a body of material to analyze with algorithms and methods. The contexts that we have, set out for ourselves, just very loosely, I've listed some here's. Why do people reuse? When do they reuse? This is what we're exploring. But to cut a long story short, there's all sorts of reasons, but we could say that there's, from very early in the Islamic period, there's a lot of oral, statements of texts. And this kind of oral situation mixed with writing makes people accustomed to interiorizing and sort of owning texts, and that liberates them to recreate them themselves by reusing. When you have multiple governmental centers, you have multiple places to produce and patronize texts. Bureaucracy, you've got people trained, this is another kind of context, core context. Arabic is heritage. We know Arabic today as heritage. It's been a heritage for a very long time, and many works have been produced, reproduced, changed, commented upon. We have a whole vocabulary of this within the KITAB project that we've looked at. So this heritage aspect of Arabic has fostered a lot of reuse, reproduction of texts. And also writers. Karen Bauer recently mentioned, very recently, yesterday I think, that we should think about how authors frequently lived in a sort of precarious situation with regards to their own students. And when you had students, you cited other people, you became part of a network. Also, if you think about, there were no footnotes. You couldn't cite a work and say, go look it up. No, you cited the text itself. So we find in our data quite a lot of that kind of citation of the original work itself. We've gone now to a corpus that has 2 billion words, and it's growing, and I've just given a few of the data formats here, if you're curious. And we've begun to really look at text reuse then across these different contexts and regions. And in terms of, for distant reading, which I'll deal with now first, we have 1.5 million files. I'm going to deal with distant reading and then close reading, in that order. We have 1.5 million files, and in these files, every one of them contains passages that align between one book and another. So on this graph here, you have all of the parts of one book that align with all the parts of another book. So all of these files then can be exploited and analyzed, for data. Almost all of our books align with another one. So it's very rare to have a book of our 2 billion word corpus that's, a solo work that doesn't talk to anyone else. It's very rare. In terms of close reading, we work on these alignments to understand the details, which is what you have here. So Peter Verkinderen on the team has created a diff viewer so that you can read these alignments and try to understand by color what's been rearranged, what's been added, what's been subtracted. So we can look, and I'll show you more, at individual cases in a lot of very forensic detail. We're also working on citation practices. So what do people say they're doing? We can show you, and I will, cases where we have proof of some form that there's a relationship of some form between this text and that text, schematically. So at some point in history, either this one got it from that one, or that one got it from this one, or they had a common origin, or it was diffuse across culture. There's a variety of ways to understand that. But what you want to know in the end is, what do they say they're doing? How are they explaining it? So we have quite a lot of data on that. One of the main pieces of data for this, and Ryan Muther on the team has been working on this, is nsnads. So for those who don't know what an nsnad is, and I think many of you will, but not everyone, an nsnad is a citation. It's a kind of citation. So here I've given you an example that, and remember, these are common in pre-modern times, but you even will find them in today's texts occasionally too. So Muhammad ibn Humayd told me, Haddathani, that Jarir said that he was told by Mughira from this other guy, Al-Musayyib ibn al-Rafi, that Abu Huraira, who is a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, said, Abraham never lied, except on 3 occasions. So that whole structure, this down to Abu Huraira, is an isnad. And that's a very, very common way of citing in Arabic. And this is called the matan. And we're less concerned with that right now, but we care about both. This way of citing, which is so important, runs through the Arabic tradition. And it has a periodization. It has an important kind of element that I think is coming through in our work more as we look more at this data at a distance and up close. My PhD supervisor, Bill Graham, has written this quote, which I think really catches it. He's called the fascination with people and isnads and connection. He also has this term ittisaliya, to say that truth does not reside in documents, however authentic, ancient, or well-preserved, but in authentic human beings and their personal connections with one another. Documents alone, without a line of persons possessed of both knowledge and righteousness to teach and convey them across the years, are useless as instruments of authoritative transmission. So if you find something and it fell off the truck, it's not good enough. You want to know and verify. This notion of verification is one of the terms I've been using. It's extremely important for a lot of knowledge. It doesn't only happen through isnads, and that's important to note, but it's a major mechanism across centuries of Islamic history. Those names are a problem, though. So we have all these names, it's the same guys that I just mentioned, But, you might be referred to in a variety of ways in the same text, especially if the author knew him. If the author knew him, just like we refer to, I've got my children here, I might refer to my son as, oh, I'm going to embarrass them, but I might say sweetie, I might say, son of so-and-so, I might say, there's a variety of ways that you refer to people you're close to. You might give them a nickname, and it's the same. Russian is particularly complicated in this regard, as some of you may know. Arabic too. So we have to deal with all these varieties when we're trying to track down all these folks and figure out how many people are they and who are they, and what is where do we find a biography on this one? Is that the same one as that one? We're always asking these questions, and we have these. But this kind of work, which Masume Saidi is quite a special. She just finished her PhD defense yesterday and graduated with magna cum laude. I'm very proud of her. She's on the team. She's the digital lead. She specializes in this problem, of names and named entities, for geography especially. Right. Distant reading, okay? So we could pause and I could ask you if you have any questions, but maybe I'll go on and you can be patient with me. But I'm going to take what I've told you, hope you're oriented a little bit, and now take you on a rough and ready quick run across the global vision of the Arabic tradition and what we know so far. So distantly. Okay, here's some stats. So from all of those 1.5 million files that I mentioned earlier, we have the following. 27 text pairs have more than 10,000 records in common. So you remember the sheet I showed you when I said this is an Arabic passage, that's in Arabic. 10,000 of those between two books. And these are unique versions, I should say. So 86 have 5,000 and so on. 700,000 have less than 10. So it poses itself as a graph, which you can kind of see here, that we've got a small number that are incredibly intensively connected to each other, and we have a lot that are very vaguely connected to each other. We're most interested, of course, or we are most interested in this part of the graph, right? In those that have quite a lot of connection, a little bit less interested in the ones that just have a few records. Often those few records are names. Remember the nsnad discussion? You've got the way that the algorithms that we're working with, let me just say, so I mentioned Turnitin. The algorithms that we're working with are not Turnitin. PASM is the name of the major algorithm, and it operates in a shingling fashion that allows, it's quite forgiving, so it allows for gaps, but it has to have at least, depending on how you set it, let's say 20 words within 300 with some gaps in between. So it captures quite a lot. It doesn't capture everything. It doesn't capture paraphrase particularly well, but this is the kind of data that we get from it. I'll be happy to speak more about PASM afterwards. So what we can see is that there's a small number, or a relatively small number, of connections between, very, very intensive connections between works, relative to the long tail of small connections. But we can also say that when you have a text within the corpus as a whole, as I said, most of the texts are connected in some fashion. And then when you have a text that on average, if you take any part of it and you break it up, into pieces of 300 words, that one of those tokens in any text, one of those pieces in any text will indeed be connected to some other text. So in other words, the pairs show us 1.5 million between two texts, but if you look at one text and see how it branches everywhere, it's very rare to find parts of that text that aren't connected to something else too. I hope that makes sense. So we're interested both in how two works are related, but also the network. And so the network is made up of these parts of one text and all the other connections across, and then their connections to each other. Maxim Romanov on the team has created this network visualization, and you may think he drew that, but he didn't. That's an actual representation of the networks of text reuse across the corpus of 2 billion words. So all of the relationships between the texts. In fact, that's the unique version, so it's a little less than, it's 1 point something. Anyway, that's all the connections between them, and it's a spaghetti monster. It's another expression for it. There's just so many connections between any work and other works, and parts of any work and multiple other works. So what does this tell us? Well, it goes back to some of the context that I outlined. People are reproducing works, in imperial bureaucracies. They feel they have, a connection to the text because they've been reading it out loud, and then therefore they can reproduce it with their own students in new forms and update it, like this updating. But broadly, even more generally, we could say that medieval readers and authors expected this. They expected authors to reuse past works, and it really wasn't a problem. Like, we may think it's strange, perhaps, maybe you don't, with all of the way in which social media works now. You might not think it's strange, but it certainly was expected and normal that people cited other works. And also, there's a lot of works, and this is a very big issue in the field of historiography, that you could only get through other texts. In other words, if you wanted to know many different topics, the work that you originally read might be gone. It might have been swallowed up into another work. So you may have felt you had access to an earlier work through a later one. It's really common. Some kind of examples of how this happens in more detail. You might have closely related witnesses to a work. So a witness is an author creates something. Maybe he speaks it out loud, his students write it down, or he writes it himself. And then you have its reproduction, but there's changes. It's common. We have lots of situations where you have a work and then you have a redo of it, but only parts of it. It's very common. You might have a work that is transmitted completely, but put into a big codex with other works, like an anthology. Think Reader's Digest, for those who know it. So that kind of reproduction within another work, anthologizing, is common. The long version becomes a short version, or you might have tiny little excerpts pulled together into a work. All of these are contexts where you have very specific kinds of reuse, where people expected it, it wasn't surprising, and where governments, you might have had centralized governments or madrasas or teaching situations, etc., that warranted it. So this kind of large ecology, is made up of these very specific examples. One of the results of this is that, if we're again thinking distant, is that you'll have very different versions of the same text, of what we think maybe today of as the same text. So this example, which I've written about, is the muata, and we have a colleague here, Asusho, who's working on the muata, is what is sometimes referred to, and at least in our corpus, they were both called muata and both attributed to Malik. But if you align them with, as we have here, and look at them against each other, there's a rearrangement. And the way this alignment works is, picture a scroll kind of laying out, rolled out, 300 words along the x-axis here. And this is a second book along the x-axis, 300 words, segments. Right? And these lines represent connection between them. So we took different versions, so same title, same author, same date, and compared them to each other. And we see that, oh wait, we may say these are both muata, but they're clearly not, because there's arrangements. Something's going on here. And these different transmitters here that I've listed, had different versions, of the original text. Remember, I mentioned different witnesses. These are different witnesses. It's a different witness situation. We looked at this across all of the corpus. We compared all the versions to all the titles, author, date, all those things the same to every other version of the same work. So this would often be that one produced a publisher, a different publisher, for example, a different editor. And what we found was that these are the earliest centuries of Islamic history. So those first periods, much greater difference between version 1 and 2 than later periods. That's a word match basis. So you could say, though, that percentage of shared, this is what goes here, increases. So in later periods, you have a closer proximity of versioning. But in the early periods of Islamic history, you have much more difference between versions. And perhaps we already knew this. We didn't graphically have this, but perhaps we already knew that the earlier tradition was a more, as Gregor Scholler had said, a tradition that relied upon teaching mechanisms and orality, and the issue of who is the recension by, it's much more important even in the earlier period, perhaps in the later. But statistically, that's what we find in our text. Lost works. We don't think about this often enough in terms of the tradition. Why do we not have the original, we want to call it that, Sirah of Ibn Ishaq? So the original biography of the Prophet written by Muhammad ibn Ishaq, who died in 767. It's unusual. I mean, this is a major work, but we don't actually have the original work. What people often cite as Sirah is Ibn Hisham's recension of Ibn Ishaq. But in the corpus that we have hundreds, of quotations from Ibn Ishaq across hundreds of years. So hundreds of different sources across hundreds of years. So it's scattered, this Ibn Ishaq's text, not just Ibn Hisham, but across. And so we did a project with the Qatar National Library, and Kevin Jakes played a major role in this, Abdurrahman Azam, Matthew Barber, putting together a portal where we showed and compared these different versions of the text to show where can you find Ibn Ishaq and what works, where, and so this is a visualization too. We've also graphed at a distance these nsnads that I'm mentioning. So in order to understand this practice, when does it arise, when does it end, and at least according to our numbers, you can see that it's not constant over time. The top line is all works in the OpenITI corpus, and you can see a peak in the period that I'm going to mention in just a minute, in the lifetime of Ibn Asakir, so in around the 12th century. These are Hijri dating on the bottom line, so Islamic centuries. And then it's sort of tapering off. Interestingly, works that are classified by Karl Brockelman as history in our classifications have sort of a different graph slightly. That's the blue graph. So they follow by a century or two. Okay. That's some distant learnings from 5 years of this work. Let me give you some close ones. Are you still awake? Okay. Okay, first, text reuse. This is a manuscript. You already knew that. So this is a manuscript from Shiraz that I've worked on with one of my former students, Majid Montazar Mahdi. And we studied it and were able to use text reuse algorithms to work out that this fragment here came from an earlier work by Abu Hanifa ad-Dinawari. So this is a manuscript from the 14th century in Shiraz, where somebody wrote into the notes this bit from this earlier work of Abu Hanifa ad-Dinawari. It deals with Abu Muslim in a really important period in the early Islamic Abbasid period. So that wasn't known to the catalogers. So it was really quite satisfying, to type it in, to search, and to discover that. We also, Majid and I, did a lot of work on this manuscript, and this is all contemporary with the period of working on text reuse, thinking about how was this manuscript created. And we came up with the idea that this manuscript was created as a result of a workshop in Shiraz, where you had people who were writing pieces of text, you had paper production running, and it's quite a messy, it's an open access work, so if you're interested, you can find it pretty easily. It's quite a messy manuscript, but critically, the margins here and the pages were produced at the same time. And so you have pages with text and no margins, and margins with no text. So this was right in a critical moment where you have conflict between a particular sort of sub-dynasty, the Injuyids and the Muzaffarids, and there's a siege going on. So we're pretty sure that what happened is there's a creation of a collection of books in duplicate that's being produced in a time of conflict And from the colophons, and I should say there's over 400 folios to this, we could work out that it traveled, pretty soon after. So thinking about this made me think, right, what about large works and text reuse? So how do authors make really big works? Do they also use workshops? We know that when they're working on producing manuscripts, they're using workshops. Were people also writing using workshops? And in other words, I'm a writer, and I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to write a history, and I want it to cover from, let's say, pre-Islamic times up to my own day in the 14th century. I'm going to assign you, okay, you're doing, the first century, you're doing the second century, you're doing the third, you're doing the fourth, and this kind of divvying up, of writing. And I thought that sounded plausible because we've got a very small number of works in the corpus that represent word-wise, disproportionate place. But we weren't able to prove that. So this is a dead end. But for reasons I'm saying here, that the reuse was too imprecise when we looked at it. Authors explain their works in other ways. Manuscript tradition does not generally support that. So we don't have like multiple hands on an authorial manuscript. So this was a dead end in one way. But it also, got us thinking about how to work on size. If it's not by workshop, we ruled that out. Big works, not workshop, probably. Maybe there's exceptions, and I would be delighted if anyone wants to share an example with me, please, especially prior to the 13th century. What can we say they're doing? This is just to represent the size of, these authors that wrote over 1 million word works in the corpus. So tree map, ones on the left, all of them versus just the ones on the wrote 1 million word work. So in what remains of my time, I'm going to talk you through 2 examples and say what we found through a close reading of what people were doing. The first case involves Tabari, who I wrote about in my book quite a lot, who's a very well-known historian. He's called, as I say here, the shadow of Herodotus by a 19th century scholar based in Baghdad, and he wrote very wordy works. There's Masumi Said and I have a series of 8 blogs if you're interested in a whole data set dealing with what I'm going to tell you now. But we asked the question is, how big was his source space? How many people does he credit? What form might the material have taken? To what extent do all 3 of his works that are listed here? What are they? Do they rely on a common source? Does he copy one into the other? How do you do it? How do you do it? In an age before print, before electricity, before light, not in a workshop, not with a lot of help, how did he make such big works? That was the question. We took the nsnads, we come back to nsnads, and we worked on citation. We looked at the phrase, which is he told me, he told us, that I showed you earlier, hadathana, hadathani. And this is by far the most common phrase that Tabari uses in his book. And this is his history. And out on the x-axis here, split into pieces, you have, it's hard to see in this room, but online I think you can see better. Blue dots represent all the phrases, all the times, again, as if you're rolling the book out like a scroll, that you have the phrase hadathana or hadathani in it. So these lines represent parts in the book that represent different times. So most importantly, here is the founding of Baghdad in this line, you can say. This is the pre-Islamic period. So across the history, which runs from here to here, you have lots of blue dots. And I'm sorry for the light, but trust me, I promise. Even more so in his Quran commentary, and even more so in his book on tradition, Tathib. So these are all cases, again, of blue dots representing the words hadathana, hadathani through a search that Masumi wrote with a regular expression. Here we have again our isnad that I used a minute ago, just to bring us back to isnads again, citations. And close up, we have again this issue of the names that we had to deal with. I asked you how many people did he get this text from? We had to deal with the names, the number of names, the ways he referred to people by the same person by the same name. So Muhammad ibn Humayd, he called Muhammad ibn Humayd, but he also called him Muhammad ibn Humayd al-Razi. called him Ibn Humayd. He also called him other things too. All good, I think. He didn't call him Sweetie. I know he didn't. So working on this, in a lot of work on named entities, which I can only apologize to my family because they've heard this expression named entities far too much. We worked to try to create tables that unified those names. So if we had all the different versions of Muhammad ibn Humayd's name, we unified them into one. He only got to be called Ibn Humayd. So we then created sort of lists of all these isnads where we put in and replaced Ibn Humayd wherever there were the varieties of names. And we used Latin script to normalize, the term normalization, to normalize this because it was easier working between the Arabic and trying to normalize to have a different script, to look at. So we could see what wasn't normalized and what was very quickly, and we could try to get as much normalized as possible. What we found was that his source base was really not so big. And this was a big shock for me. And I think I'm looking at Shane, I think it's quite a shock. Yeah. He's known as the traditionist par excellence. He's the guy who cites isnads, for early Islamic history. His books have been reprinted without the isnads in order to get around the problem of modern readers not wanting to read isnads when they read Tabari in Arabic. But it's not an infinite number of people, actually, that he says, so-and-so told me, hadathana, hadathani. In fact, here, the number of names, the distinct names, and I've given you the names here along the side, including Muhammad ibn Humayd, it's 10 represented 60% of all of our citations. So 10 people played a huge role, in informing Tabari of what he writes in his history. We can go into the weeds and, talk about, does this mean that it's exactly 10? Was it 12? Or, what about? But the picture is very clear, is that he was relying on a small number of people intensively when he worked. And that's for his history, his tafsir, and for his tathib. So nearly 5 million words worth of text. We could not have known that by reading these texts. We just couldn't work that out. The other thing was that, again, when we looked at the death dates, and this is close reading. We had to look these up. We had to study biographical dictionaries. He settled in Baghdad in 870. He comes from the Caspian region prior to that. He settles in 870. He does a lot of traveling. So prior to 870, when he sets up shop, and then later, much, much later, writes his books, all of these people that we identify as these, what we're calling direct informants, the people hadathana, they precede, they're earlier. So he knew them he encountered them and got whatever he got from them early and much earlier than his works that he wrote down. And this is a real conundrum. So I think earlier scholars have often assumed people memorized everything. But it just does not seem possible for a number of reasons. The long date, between the one and the other, the fact that they're interspersed quite forensically, within the texts, the fact that some of these are very long passages, and also, as I'll come to in a minute, the fact that we can find the same passage in multiple texts. So triangulating all of this, we've concluded that he's working with notebooks, of passages that he's written down by his teachers in a period of his youth, even, or younger years, and that we can even, and this is going to sound audacious, I think, but reconstruct them to some extent. We can't tell you what was on what page, we can't do that, but we can look at the isnads and these chains, and we can speculate on the contents. We have a harder time saying what's not in them, but we can say within them, based on the common material, we have these sets of notebooks. So we've published and listed out these notebooks. And these represent a tree map that goes back, some generations in the isnads to show the common link and the material that hypothetically we think represents the major bulk of the material of the notes. So this one I think is particularly interesting here. Here again, Muhammad ibn Humayd, back to him. Ibn Ishaq, so the Sirah, he's one of the major transmitters, along with Ibn Hisham. So he's a major transmitter of the Prophet's biography, and Tabari is filled with prophetic biography. But also these other works. So the isnad that I've been citing to you is this one, Jarir, Mughira, they're going here. So these are major pieces of what we think a notebook would have had, but importantly, he would have been copying down pieces that had been copied by others earlier. So there's this churning within the tradition into a notes system is very important. Again, we're not the only ones to believe there were notebooks, but to be able to argue that we can say what was in these notebooks, that's, I think, rather novel. We hoped that we would find, a question has been, did he copy all the parts on the Prophet's biography into the tafsir? Surely he must have done that, right? Well, earlier generations by intuition said probably not, and I think we can also agree with them that probably not, because the relationships between the works are just too distant. So when we look at the precision between passages using our text reuse data, so combining citations with text reuse, we see that there really, there are changes of words, there's changes of word order. It more bespeaks a notebook that he went back to over and over again over many years. Remembering that these are very large works, and he's producing them partly simultaneously, but over decades in one case. So one of the things in my next book is I try to imagine the place he did that. I try to imagine the room in which he worked and how he was reconstructing. One thing we found also, which was a bit of a surprise, was that when we looked at the text reuse situation with Tabari, remember I said this line here, or maybe you don't remember, but anyway, this part here is the founding of Baghdad. Again, rolling the book out like a scroll in 300-word pieces. And this part here, those red dots, they're not blue. There aren't blue dots there. So there's no hadathana, hadathani, there's no he told me, It's passive, he uses the passive voice. So he says, dhukira an. And he doesn't say who. So this is a passive voice I've heard from, I was told. And what we were able to work out was the very close alignment with Ibn Abi Tahir, an earlier scholar's work, that he never cites. So he never cites this earlier work for the founding of Baghdad onwards, but it's very much prevalent in his work. And this is also, it was pointed out by Hans Keller in 1908, but has been pretty much neglected because I think the tradition of historians thought that he was being too naive. So that, of course, there's intertextuality, and just, let's not pay attention to that. But actually, he seems to be using it. And we used this within our work on the KITAB team within a project that we were analyzing text reuse to verify. So I've read 33 of these alignments for 14,000 words very closely, and can tell you that he's very closely copying Ibn Abi Tahir. If you've used anti-plagiarism software, you know what that feels like. When you found it, and you're like, oh, right, okay, they changed that word? Okay, yeah, it's like that. It's very much like that. So I just give one example here, where he starts with saying, Ibn Abi Tahir in his text, which we have in the corpus, gives a whole isnad, and then Tabari makes fast with that, says, it's related, that he cuts out Ibn Abi Tahir. And that's the case for all, for all of the isnads. For all the material that's covered. So the consequence then is how we work with this major text of Islamic history should change. Especially if we want to tell the story of Baghdad using, Tabari is, as I said, sort of the Herodotus of Arabic. If you're going to tell the story this is bold, I'm going to say it. If you're going to tell the story of Baghdad using Tabari, you better pay attention to what Ibn Abi Tahir said, if you want to know what Tabari thought. Because you can look at the both of them together and understand something. Tabari cared about people, and he cared about some people a lot. So that those 10 people, 20, it's a small number, it's not infinite. Why doesn't he cite Ibn Abi Tahir? That's a great question. There's probably a few reasons. One, this is early in the written tradition. Perhaps norms were not worked out. you could say. Second, maybe there's different norms for history versus poetry. Poetry, there's lots of conversations in the literature about literary theft, sadaka. And in fact, Ibn Abi Tahir himself wrote about sadaka. So there was a notion of what we might think of as plagiarism, we'll call it literary theft. But obviously, Tabari didn't take too much stock in that. But I think the bigger point is that we find in the sources criticisms of Ibn Abi Tahir as being someone who relies on books, not people. So he's called a Sahafi. And this term is used to refer to him by another scholar named Asuli. And it seems to me that he didn't like him. I mean, I hate to be that blunt, but he didn't think he was reliable. He thought he could get the material without citing him. And in a way, you don't thank the postman. I mean, he wasn't going to, maybe you should thank the postman, I'm sorry, but, but he wasn't thanking the person who got the material from. He treated him as a neutral kind of receptacle into the text. Also, he wasn't citing the person, he was citing a book. He cites people, but he doesn't cite books. And I think that's really important. So I would say there's a major distinction within the Arabic tradition in this period of citing a person versus a book. Oftentimes, scholarship focuses on the oral versus the written. But to me, that gets it the wrong way around. Really, the issue is people. You could verify things with people. You may get material through people orally, but the point is it's people. And then you've got books, which are something else. You may get books that are mediated by people, but a book without a person could be problematic, and that's, I think, really critical. So you needed to be taught, you needed to learn. And I'm running out of time. I'm way overdue. Can I have 5 more minutes? Will you indulge me for 5 more minutes? Okay, it's taken me a long time to get here. Okay, so having done Tabari, having worked on Tabari, and it took a long time. It took a really long time to work on all those names. And a lot of it's really tedious. We set our task to work on Ibn Asakir, because if Tabari wasn't hard enough, we were going to deal with someone whose book is 2.8 times bigger than the corpus that we dealt with Tabari, and see, could we get on with that? This is, again, Masumi Saidi and I will be publishing on this too. So 40% of his history of Damascus is made up of isnads, of these citations. So it's a lot of isnads. It's a lot of names. It's, in fact, Masumi and I are still trying to work it out, but we think it's more than 100,000 names, in different forms. It's not 100,000 people, see above reference to all the different Humaids, but, it's a lot of names. And we asked some questions that were similar. So how big was his source base? What form might the material he obtained have been? And then we thought, right, what are these author names? Because he cites authors all the time in the isnads. What does that mean? What does that signify? Here's what we found. Again, lightning. First, there's a lot of names, and having spent months now trying to disambiguate them, also with a key member of the team, Hamid Reza, who's been critical in helping me in these last stages, trying to figure out who is who. We found that, in fact, the top, so the line with Tabari was 10, right? Under 10 gave you 60%, 20 with Ibn Asakir. This I just worked out three days ago. I have to tell you that I was shocked, that it was that small a number for that many direct informants that he's attributing this knowledge. So 40% of the largest book in our corpus, over 8 million words, start with hadathana, hadathani. Well, start with a lot more terms that I'll come to in a minute, but you can trace all of the variety of those first people's names to 20 people when you disambiguate. And I think it's a lot fewer, actually, because the complications of dealing with these isnads is that when he makes lists, we have a hard time separating them, and there's a lot of typological errors, typographical errors. So it's probably closer to 10, in fact, which, I think we found something like the Pareto principle of citation in Arabic books. So if the 80-20 rule, if you're familiar with the 80-20 rule, there's something like that operating, within the Arabic tradition at large when you have these isnads and citations, that it may seem like an infinite number of people, it's not, are directly attributed. It comes down to a small number of people being cited a lot. You have a long tail of single citations of one person about people we have no idea who they are. But if you look at the most frequent people, that top part of a graph, let's say, it's a small number, actually, that are citing. In terms of his sources, and this is just to say, it's so much more complicated than Tabari. The period of the 12th century is a much more dynamic period. It's a time period of learning in new forms. The vocabulary is fascinating, and we are working on it. Some critical terms, though, are qara'tu bi khat, like I read something in the handwriting. He distinguishes between people in books. He rarely cites titles. So we've looked at all the titles that Jens Schreiner, who I've listed here, and I mean this to engage directly with Jens's conclusions. We've looked at all the titles that Jens lists in what he called Ibn Asakir's library. We've searched them, with regular expressions across the history of Damascus, and we can find very few, surprisingly few instances. And often one of these author isnads with that author's name, tens of thousands of words, no title. It's very rare to see a title with one of these isnads. So he's citing people, but he's not citing books, to go back to my point. He's citing, the person who was known to have written the book, but he's really not very often citing the book itself. He talks about books, he talks a lot about books, but citing, is a different matter. So this is just some stats, to again deal with this issue of authors. And this is work in progress, I've got to emphasize. But of all those isnads that we have now in this case, which is 78,000 or so for Ibn Asakir, 23% of them do mention an author's name, which is intriguing. So what is he dealing with then? Like, what is the material he actually has to hand? And I think we're believing now that he's dealing with pieces of works, much more like Konrad Hirschler has described in writing about Damascus and, for example, the Ashrafiyya catalog, that there's lots of cases of portions of works being transmitted, and quite sloppy sometimes, pieces, etc. So there's a much more maybe dynamic, maybe owned, more dispersed set of things. So we've looked at, here's Muhammad ibn Sa'd, another great biographer, and we've traced chains of citation back to him in what looks like, I think, an underground map. But you can perhaps grasp that, like, here there's 3 different people that he's transmitting from. And these are the Hadathani people. These are the people who says he got stuff straight from our Akhbarana. And so it's quite a complicated picture. He got his stuff from Ibn Sa'd perhaps by 3 people. Someone closer to his own lifetime, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, got it through far more. So you might think that he knew people who knew Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, but he doesn't actually cite just one of them. He cites, I'm still not sure how many. I'm guessing 30, it's a guess, but I'm working on it. And we have 250 different sort of surface forms, different forms of people uniquely referenced as giving from Al-Khatib. Some of those will be the same person with a different name. I've been trying to reconcile them, but I'm still at 250. I mean, that just gives you a sense of how many people he's getting stuff from. So, by way of conclusion, probably anxious to go have a drink or something to eat. People. I'd like to emphasize that people matter today, and they mattered historically. And that when we think of books, this issue of the person as the informant, as the direct informant, I think mattered enormously to our authors. I've given you here some pictures of my own teachers and some people who are very dear to me. Interestingly, they're standing with books, which I hadn't really been aware of when I first looked at these photos. So it continues, this issue of people as representing books. My PhD supervisor, Roy Matahada, and again, William Graham here, and a variety of other people very close and dear to me. the future of the field then will continue with this. We'll continue, I hope, with this digital work that we're doing. You'll see, inshallah, a couple of books in the next 2 years of our own that represent the works of the KITAB project and all of its team members. So different team members are writing different chapters. I'm responsible for volume 1, which is outlining the field, as I've just done to you now, and much of this comes from that book. The second book is dealing with memory, going back to this issue of memory using text reuse detection. For now, I'll just say very quickly, there'll be a Center for Digital Humanities launching at some point within the AKU, and we're very excited about that. So we'll invite you to that within due course. And the team is working on an API, so Application Programming Interface. Sohail Merchant's here in the room. He's been doing a lot of work on that. Matthew Barber, Masume Saidi, Peter Vakindran. So we're trying to find ways to make all the research available to other projects. We believe very strongly in open access. I'm working with open source software, and we want to give back to an ecology of a system. So this also comes through in our teaching and training. We've been trying to do more training and teaching of students. We have a user group if anyone's interested in joining it. We give you access to the data. We ask that you acknowledge the ERC, acknowledge the KU and ISMC and the KITAB. But we really want all of our data to become available. And when we publish the books, all of the data will be published for anyone to use. We think this will then change over time, not just us, but because of other similar work, the way that digital reading happens, because all of this stuff on citation practices that we're talking about and the names and the disambiguation, et cetera, can feed into how reading applications work online. So Matthew created this kind of very stark presentation to show you read the critical edition, which has been mediated all the problems, but you can do a lot more. You can identify people. You can find similar stories using text reuse detection across our corpus, et cetera. So that's it. Another picture with more people. We have a team for which I'm eternally grateful, many of whom I think are online now, and more people having fun pictures of the KITAB team. Particularly like that one of Matsume and Sohail and Maxime. And other people, Majid Mahdi in the top right, who co-wrote the article on the Corpus manuscript, Matt Miller, who's been working on the OCR effort, Isabel Terrell-Nehoff, and also Antoine again, and more people from events where we presented and where we engage with the field. And they're having a lot of fun. That's why I included the one with the boat, because we're spring. Start to think like that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have this camera, hello, and we have Leif. We discussed about how best to deal with questions, and we thought maybe it's easier to I'll just take them and
make sure the one online have a chance as well.
Exactly, and Leif said yes to make sure, just in case I can't hear you, that the people online have access as well. So in fact, if you're online, please raise your hand, and we have a system worked out here where my colleagues in the back will call on you and you can ask your question, right? You can also type it in to the chat if you feel more comfortable. And if you're driving a car, please do not. Okay. Thank you. Do we want to switch to the Zoom so we can see folks? Sorry. Brilliant.
Hi. Congratulations, Professor Savant.
Thank you.
3 years late, but I guess well deserved, and Mabruk.
Thank you.
You approached Turnitin and you had your experiences with Turnitin. What if somebody approached you and asked for the same help? I work with the Devanagari script. I work with Khojki script.
Yeah.
And let's say I want to analyze the text that I have access to. and I want to use the system that you have invested in, would it be, is it versatile enough to take other languages? Can the algorithms work with the other scripts? What are those possibilities like?
Yeah.
Do we have those possibilities of working with you on this?
Thank you. It's a brilliant question. We haven't tried, so the OpenITI, which I have not spoken enough about, although I did try to cram quite a lot in a short time. The OpenITI is the corpus to which KITAB's contributing all of the Arabic texts, and it also includes Persian, Urdu, and we aspire other Islamic languages, although Devanagari, you can tell me maybe not, as an Islamic language, but we'd be happy and very happy to have Devanagari in the corpus. So we've been working on OCR, we've been working on getting more texts in that represent, let's say, scripts that are underserved, by all sorts of applications, because the work on text reuse, just as an example, there's other kind of works, began with English, and similar, most digital humanities is very oriented towards English. So yes, is the short answer. We would be delighted, and we have tutorial that the team's developed on PASM, so how to do PASM yourself, and we'd be happy to speak to you. Any sharing.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. Which one? Oh, this is. Okay. So let's do one online, then we'll do one in person. Okay.
So you have a question now from Kashid Sanakhan, who says, we know that context is important for understanding the meaning of any text. I'm wondering, when you calculated the frequency of words in thousands of texts you were comparing, how did you manage to keep context attached to text so that meanings are conveyed too?
Good question. Okay, so is that speaking about citation?
The word frequencies.
The word frequencies, right?
And different levels and different.
So that's only within a small number of texts, then, right? So that's not across the whole corpus, although we do that too in other contexts. So, right. There's a variety of metadata if you wanted to do that kind of search, on a larger scale. So looking within our text, we can plot them, across any particular work, any word and its occurrence. We also importantly do annotation of the text, and Lawrence used to sitting here, who leads that effort. So we have the structure of the text encoded, so that when users take our texts offline and they read them in free software like EditPad Pro, they can see and fold and see where things occur. So we enable that kind of close reading through the format of the texts, and has importantly been given to us by the open sources that we've taken these texts from. But we work a lot with the annotation. I don't know if that helps to answer. Okay. Should we do one from here? Okay.
Hi. So earlier on you said lots of information gets forgotten the further on in history you go. So, sorry. Okay, I have a second, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Someone else like to go.
We've got another question online, if you want to do that while you...
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I'm glad you're asking a question, Joanne. Yeah. Take a minute. Yeah, we'll go online. Let's do one online.
Sure, so we got a question from Ustream. Apologies for probably mispronouncing that name. So she says, thank you for the interesting talk. The guitar project seems to work intensely on textual aspects of the manuscripts. Is there any analysis of the manuscript notes, comparing them with the history of text for this?
Can you read the last part of that question? I'm sorry.
Sure. Is there any analysis of the manuscript notes and comparing them with the history of the text itself? Right.
So for us, our first work is not manuscripts. We're working with digital text. So sorry, machine readable texts. The digital text might refer to the image of the text. So we're working with the machine readable files. We are interested in marginal notes, as I showed for the Dinawari piece, in the sense that we can track them. For example, if we can get manuscript scripts into machine readable format, then we can do quite a lot. And that's the next major horizon, in digital humanities is, let's hope, because of advances in OCR, and this is what the Mellon Grant is funding for us, and for the University of Maryland. 10 years from now, if we have a machine readable file for every manuscript that we can get our hands on, then we'll be able to say a lot more. Then we can look at those notes. There's issues of segmentation, for the audience movement. So right now, line extraction is a current challenge. But manuscript OCR is moving really fast, so it's coming, which is brilliant. Because as much as we say 2 billion words, we know that's a drop in the bucket, of what was created. And Peter Verkindren's writing a chapter in our book on this.
Okay, so would you say it gets harder the further along in history you get to find evidence? So if you went a few thousand years ago, would it get a lot harder to find that for modern historians?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So if you think of, yes, normally, I guess is the short answer. Normally that's true, but what's so interesting is you get these fossilized pieces within the written tradition. So people who work on lost sources are particularly excited when they find, let's say, a text, so you have a machine readable file and you're studying it and you can tell from authorial attribution that it was written mostly by one person, but a piece of it is written in a very different way. And then you say, right, okay, we've got a different hand, even if it's all in machine readable format, a different hand here. And then you somehow get way back in time, prior to the period of that author. So this is a major question for historians, the so-called lost texts, is how do you know that a piece that, it'll often be the case they say, well, I read this in a book. It's kind of a trope, but is it a trope? Is it real that they really did read it in a book? Often they did, we think. But you can use the digital to try and understand that. Is it another way? Manuscripts, there's never a substitute for. If you have interesting manuscripts that have different hands, but you may not have that. And you often don't with very fossilized pieces. Thank you.
It's not a question, it's a very simple one. I was wondering if the corpus can work on the text reconstruction then, or if you have ever tried it within the network of text that you have in the corpus. Have you tried to just pull out a new text?
I like reconstructing a lost source through
the lost source, reconstruction.
So the Digital Seer project kind of went to that, to take different witnesses. I think we're more inclined to want to collect the different possible witnesses and then to leave it there. The Mellon Grant has a piece in it for creating new editions, and that would entail some sort of comparison of witnesses that are very different and could be undertaken then to include pieces that are lost in the lost text, extracted in some form. It is such a thorny issue, such a thorny issue. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and I think right now that's where we're at. As a team, like let's figure out how many, the Pareto principle of citation, for example. Let's figure out the big picture, of what we can find. I think there's generations of work to be done, after, and including, I hope, with us, but I think for me personally, lost text is a tricky one. I'd like our next grant to deal with that as a piece, but carefully.
There are some trials with Makrizi and
exactly,
and
and we have a couple people on the team now who are working on Makrizi. He's the best example, but he's kind of unique. Sorry, this is just for those. There's an author who we have autograph witness, so we have autograph text, we have his handwritten notes, we have lots of stuff for him. So you can answer questions that you might not be able to answer for other authors. But the problem, from my point of view of working on the 9th and 10th centuries, is he's much later. So how representative is he? And he's only one guy. I mean, there's others, but not many. Jonas.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you about the creative writing side of that little thing that you mentioned of you imagining Tabari's workplace and workspace.
Yeah.
How far have you come in that?
Thank you. It was the most joyful thing I've done in years, to be honest. I often feel, and I think many historians do as well, trapped. I just wanted to make something up. I just wanted to be able to imagine something. Every time, you feel like I'm going to say there's 10 people. Oh, but were there 12? Were there 12? Have I really got it? So I've written it. I've written like this piece where I speculate that it's the morning of such and such and the lights coming in through the window and he's sitting on the floor. I spent quite a bit of time looking in art collections to see what kind of furniture would have been in the room and where he might have sat. And I think it matters because if you're imagining him producing a work, what happens in that moment where he's sitting, and I speculate he's sitting on the floor, on cushions, and has some sort of book prop aid, here and then maybe a table. What happens in the moment from when he looks at one thing, his notes, to the moment it gets into his work? That's a moment of memory, in a sense. In that moment, I was interested in trying to think about, like, what is he doing when he's holding something in his head? What is the creativity that's allowed in that moment between seeing something and then writing it down? So these are from notes from his teachers, as I'm trying to argue. Yeah. I think we should do a lot more of that as historians. If you have any ideas, I'd be delighted.
Just want to understand if anybody has tried to work with Sana, this Asma Hilali's work. She's identified the text which was there. She's recreated the text that was there originally.
Yeah.
The lower text.
Yeah.
And has anybody tried to see if that lower text appears in how many of these?
It's a great question. Not to my knowledge, but they should.
It's the kind of, if I had access to that database, I would do that first.
But there is a critical edition. There is someone working.
Who's working on it, but not using, I think, the algorithm.
The lower text and
the
algorithm.
It's manual.
No, but with algorithm, it should be able to, it could be a quick kind of.
Well, it's not really quick because the issue will be pointing and the orthography. So you'll have the problem of that they're unvocalized. The ha looks like the jing, or these issues of the orthography of the early Arabic.
We're going by 300 word limit, kind of.
I agree.
Matching.
No, I think there's some workarounds. These are the kinds of problems that are fun to think about. How would you deal with that?
We'd love to do it.
Is there anyone online? And then we'll continue.
Yes, you do have another one online. So we have one from someone called Megaz. So she says, Sarah, thank you for a wonderful presentation. You made a very interesting point about poetry not being reused without proper acknowledgement versus historical text. I'm wondering, within the historical prose you have analysed, did you notice differences between what was considered usable without reference to the author versus what was deemed important to acknowledge in an author's name? I'm thinking about historical passages from contemporary authors, for instance.
Right. If I understand the question correctly, do you have to cite a contemporary? Is there a difference between citing a contemporary author versus citing someone long ago? Yeah, Carly? It's hard to, here we see the breakdown in the oral versus the written. I think, let me be more general. The question of what requires attribution versus what doesn't, I don't think we know that yet. I think we're working on it. And I think that there have been scholars who have dealt with it in particular cases, for a very, very long time. So combining those two is an important next step in the field, because what we now have is, let's say, a type of evidence that shows the alignments. Previously, we had to deal with what authors said they were doing, what we knew they were because we knew the other works. But we can look at this much more expansively. My own feeling is that citing a contemporary was less common, because if you look at Ibn Asakir's sources and you also look at Tabri's sources, they're citing people long dead. That's very common. And that goes back to Hadith scholarship too. You want the shortest number of connections between you and the Prophet. So I think that carried over into history writing as well. So. We have another question here.
Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. I wondered if I could provoke you to some very distant reading. As a literary historian who knows nothing about your literary field and period, this raised all sorts of interesting questions from an English literary historian. And some of the questions that I had and that I'm hoping you might be able to answer or at least speculate on very distant reading are things like, what does this say about the shape of the literary and historical tradition in Arabic writing? Are there patterns that are emerging from this now that you couldn't see before? So for instance, are there genres in which it's more acceptable to use and reuse source texts? Are there moments in which it's more acceptable or even desirable to use original writing? So the fallout in the kind of English literary tradition would be there would be very distinct generic differences, say, between history writing, which cited previous authors as a form of authenticity, and poetic or creative writing, which would privilege originality, but may reference older mythological traditions, but not cite them directly. So the referencing would be at a different level. It might be at an allegorical or metaphorical level. And so I was curious all the way through, just my own experience of what the analogues and non-analogues between the Arabic and the Anglophone traditions might be. And I wondered if I could just provoke you to think about those very, very distant patterns. Does it say something about the Arabic tradition? I thought, for instance, the insight that people are more important than books was fascinating. But at the same time, the text, even though it's transferred orally, is still the privileged artifact, isn't it? That in a way that makes its way through those networks. And so I was interested in that kind of 150,000 foot thinking, really.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Katrina. I shouldn't say that people, the issue with books is complicated, I think. I want to stress people. But the issue is partly writerly practices and how they interact with people. And so part of what I'm trying to argue on that point is that the notion that a book in a library and people copied out a book in a library, so Jens Scheiner argued that Ibn Asakir had access to a library. And I think that's not right. I think it's much more interesting from the vocabulary that he's, that Ibn Asakir is citing. In terms of the big differences, at one point I was saying that, what is a book? It made me think, like, what is a book? If it's this thing that can be taken apart and put back together again in so many different ways, is there an infinite variety of ways to create a book that are authorized within the tradition? And the formulation of a book as a box in which you put things, sort of came to me as an object that, people would creatively put different pieces in. One major difference, I think, and I would be really interested to have a conversation with anyone who works on Chinese history writing or Chinese treatments of the past, is that, in the Arabic tradition, I think writing was terribly important, and it was important earlier, than some scholars have argued earlier, in past generations, not so much ours. I think we now understand from a lot of work on epigraphy and Quran and other fields that there's a lot of writing early. But the actual book itself, is quite late. And also, as I showed you with those versions, there's a lot of different versions of the same work that are quite distinct. So in Arabic, we also don't have, and I haven't even had time to deal with this, we don't have thousands of manuscripts of the same work. We can have the history of Tabari, which is just mind-blowing, this major, major, major work that's reused extensively throughout the tradition. When in the 19th, 20th century, scholars wanted to try and create an edition of it, they didn't have it didn't exist anywhere in the world. There wasn't a single complete edition of Tabari's history that had survived. So we have a very kind of unusual situation in that you have people constantly taking and very faithfully copying books, but maybe with an authorization system. So there's a phrase that Ibn Asakir uses, which briefly glossed over, biqira'ati alayhi. But you also don't have the same work produced over and over again. And if you think of the Chinese case, you have this examination system, you have the reproduction of the same work, or it's a caricature, and I know my colleagues working in European book history would sharply disagree, and they should, but there's a caricature of the medieval monk, copying the same work out over and over and over and over again. And that's just not normal, that's not operative, I think, on the Arabic side. Books are produced on spec, or they're produced in much more fluid situations where people want parts of things. And that, again, authorizes this recreation. So I think you have a very fluid and dynamic and creative, but very written and faithful to past writings, but not one that regarded the book as so important. That's my 300.
Because I'm quite limited in how I understand this, but if you're comparing different scripts, how do you differentiate between things that are fact and things that are fiction? So if you have people telling a story, how, and they say, oh, he said, or she said, but then you have a normal piece as well, it's just actually that work. How do you compare?
Good, okay, that's interesting. That's a very interesting question, thank you. So we're not trying to, is the short answer, is that there is a field working in Arabic that deals with the question of fiction, or myth, or ways to classify text based on ideas of knowledge authority, you might say too. We kind of take any text as it is, and I've emphasized very much history here because I work in historiography, but actually the whole KITAB project deals in much more fields, and I'm sorry if I've shortened to make it feel like everything's history writing, because there's also folks working on philosophy, people working on theology, other fields that are really important. So we're not so much interested in that. We take a text and we look at what we can tell the practices are of the person who produced it. But whether the underlying text has truth to itself or not, we leave that. Which I'm sure seems a bit shocking in some ways. Time. Are we running out of time? I think we're quite late. Yeah, I think we're quite late. Yeah? Okay. I'm going to, if anyone has questions after, please write to me. And we're happy. And also if you would like to work with KITAB's resources. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.